All right, well, I think we should get started. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to the SNS August Member Happy Hour. We are so delighted to be here today with Molly Wood, who is the Managing Director of the Launch Climate Syndicate. I think many of you may be familiar with Jason Calacanis, who founded Launch itself. Molly is an early stage climate solutions investor, podcaster, and former technology and business journalist. This is not in her pre-written bio, but she also co-hosts This Week in Startups with Jason. And prior to switching to venture capital, she was a writer, podcaster, and content creator at CNET, the New York Times, and Marketplace. So she is we met at Fortune Brainstorm and immediately hit it off. Clearly, because we have a lot of mutual interest in impact, climate, and media. And I am so delighted that she is here to talk a little bit more with us about her work. So welcome, Molly.
Thanks, Barrett. Thanks, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. We also hit it off because we're both veterans of doing way too many jobs at the same time.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. So I want to talk, first of all, you went from being a journalist, pretty successful journalist in many ways, very successful journalist in many ways, to venture capital. What prompted that switch for you? What was your impetus there?
It was definitely climate and wanting to figure out how to turn sort of the back half of my career to that topic. I was realizing, I started covering climate solutions in probably 2016 or 2017 at Marketplace, and realized it took a long time for climate to become a tech story, and I was having this conversation. I share a hairdresser with a world-renowned climate scientist, as one does if you get your hair cut in Berkeley. And she was talking about how we had really reached a tipping point with climate, that there were going to be certain impacts that we're not going to be able to avoid. And she made this sort of offhanded comment. She said, now it's an engineering problem. And so I was like, okay, great. That makes this my story. Finally, it's obviously a huge business story. I was at Marketplace at the time. It's a huge tech story. And I started talking to venture capitalists and companies and startups and discovering these new startups who were trying to think of these sort of innovative solutions. And it was a really different way to look, as a journalist, all the climate coverage I consumed was just about how bad the problem was, really. And hardly anybody was talking about solutions. And I just am, that's the kind of person I am. And it really appealed to me to think of it that way. And then it was sort of, I did this big documentary podcast series called How We Survived that I was really, really proud of. And if anything, I felt like that was, at that point, I had done every job journalism had to offer, like from radio to TV to writing to podcasting to video to maybe like I haven't been a TikTok influencer, but I edited books, the whole shaboodle, magazines. Yet there's still time to be a TikTok influencer.
Yeah. We don't recommend it, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah. We'll see if I get really desperate, if it goes really badly at Launch. And then I've known Jason Calacanis for a little over 15 years. And he, candidly had tried to hire me a couple of times and just came along at the right time. And I said, well, what I really want to do is climate. Like, you don't have it, you're a super mainstream tech firm, but I think it would send a really strong signal if a firm like Launch created, a climate tech portfolio. And I want to do this podcast segment, This Week in Climate Startups, and I want to work from home. And and Jason was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it all.
So what I'm curious, like when you coming into that space, was there a certain angle that you thought would be that you were most interested in investing in, or like a specific part of that, the climate problem is a very big problem. Like, are there specific parts of that problem that you feel like capital can really help drive solutions in?
I think that's been the most interesting. I guess I realized I did not concisely answer your first question, which was why. And it was just like, I need to get boots on the ground faster. I don't have time to change minds. Storytelling is great, really, really powerful. I hope I can do both, but I just wanted to have skin in the game.
Right.
So that was the shorter version of why. And then in terms of the what, it's been 7 months and I've made, 4 investments, 2 through our syndicate and 2 in our accelerator. And it is a process right now, I think, of figuring out, not just for me, but for all of these firms that have gotten into climate tech investing recently, all of these angel investors, like what is investable in venture compared to what should be funded by government or banks or businesses, you know, bootstrapping. And so what I'm finding is, I think based on my experience, at least, like the things that I'm most comfortable with, I really believe in consumers. I sometimes feel like the last person who believes in the power of the consumer to really drive meaningful change around climate. But I think I use the example all the time of high fructose corn syrup. Like at some point, we all sort of found out that that was poisonous at every level. And we said, get it out of our food. Or we're not, what we really said was, we're not going to buy food that has this in it, but we will buy alternatives. And then alternatives came into existence and the market really changed. And so I think consumers want to save money with more energy efficient devices. They want to drive electric cars because they have a lower footprint, but also they're really fast and super fun to drive, and getting gas in your driveway is actually amazing. And so, you know, there's this whole, one of the companies I'm looking at is basically a browser plugin that whenever you shop for something online can show you more sustainable alternatives, whether it's a used version of that thing or a thing that's made a little bit better. And I'm like, awesome, right? That's super simple. I would do that every time I shopped. And I think that's the kind of thing that sort of adds up to a lot of change and is super investable because it scales. You know, it scales.
So when you say investable, I'm curious, like, what was that in moving from being a journalist to being a venture capitalist? What did you have to, like, what was the learning curve like of what you thought you would be investing in versus what is investable?
Yeah, it's still, that learning curve is definitely still happening. And it's a super valuable thing that our president actually said to me early on was the worst decision for a VC is the $40 million business. That's like that's a great business. Like we should all aspire to have a $40 million business, but it's not a good return. And so this process of training my brain that is happening right this second to think about not just a 2x return, but a 10x return, to think like a 5x return would be great, but not ideal, that's like, I'm struggling with that every day. Because I keep running into really great $40 or $50 million businesses and being like, actually, that's probably not what our investors are going to want when it comes to their returns. It's weird. It's a weird way to think about it. But what I've learned is like math is a really harsh mistress, but it also does make things really simple. It's just math. And
when so you're looking for things with 10x return, right? That's kind of the classic investment. You know, what else are you looking for? Like, what kinds of things appeal to you beyond just the 10x return?
Yeah. So like I said, I'm really into consumer because it's something I feel like I can evaluate and understand really well. So whether it's, you know, my other accelerator investment is a company that's doing zero waste grocery delivery, where they source wholesale food, they package it in like beautiful glass jars or stainless steel containers that they've made themselves, and they deliver it to people in an electric car, which is just like, I just want that to exist so bad. It is arguably, Jason, actually, our GP, called it operationally insane. This is going to be really hard to pull off. But that's like really meaningful if people adopt solutions like that, and you get this beautiful Pinterest, you know, style pantry when you have these glass jars, and then they come pick them up again a week later, take them back, bring you new groceries like the milkman. So I'm really interested in those kind of consumer solutions that could drive a lot of behavior change and that create this like sense of coolness around decarbonization. Like, I think there's, you know, people bought Teslas because they look really cool. And that, I think there's real value in that. But I'm also into like wonky financial tools and things that drive investment through measurement. So the two syndicate deals I've done are both related to measurement, measuring the carbon emissions of commercial shipping vehicles, measuring air pollution. And I think those are things that are like, those fit really, really well within the venture capital model because they're software based, maybe some hardware, but it's hardware as a service. And then they drive money as a result.
Yeah, very cool. So I'm curious, we've talked about like the difference between venture investable tech versus, government tech that should maybe be subsidized from a government fund or an investment bank.
Mhm.
Like, what do you think are the most exciting innovations in climate tech, whether or not you can invest in them?
Right.
Personally.
Yes. There's a third category too, actually, which is venture investable opportunities that I am not qualified to evaluate, right? Like there are firms that are doing frontier tech and really hard science and really hard tech that are doing fantastic work and are, driving forward fusion. And there's a company that I just interviewed for This Week in Climate Startups that's literally making meat out of air, like turning fermenting carbon dioxide into a product that can eventually be made into a meat replacement, which is awesome and fascinating. And I meet with companies like that a lot, or companies that are uncovering novel microbes. So apparently this microbe situation is a big deal. There are like billions of different kinds of microbes and we hardly know anything about them. And you can get them to do things for you, like turn into fertilizer.
Mhm.
And, so I talked to this company, the founder is former Monsanto. It's like an incredible stacked team. This is really, really cool science that's just a little too far from commercialization for me, but I'm building this network of other investors who specialize in that kind of thing. So I can say, like, normally in the VC world, if I said, I'm not going to invest in this, but I want to send it your way, it would be a bad signal. It would be considered a negative signal because they would say, like, if this is such a hot deal, why are you not
Passed on this? Yeah.
Exactly. But I think given how many variations exist in this field, there is a really nice, I'm finding so far, maybe I'm naive, but a really nice co-opetition where I'm like, look, this is in your wheelhouse, but it's not in mine. Take it and run with it. And so hopefully I'm also helping to seed, no pun intended, investments that I can't necessarily make. Because there is some cool, weird science out there. I've interviewed a company that's doing like 3D printed rocket propulsion, like rocket fuel. That's just way lower emission and, is 3D printed instead of like derived from fossil fuels. It's a really hopeful job because everybody's taking some little slice of this and some of it adds up to gigatons and some of it adds up to systems change. And some of it is like just getting consumers to shop like a little bit differently, but you feel like if you put it all together, it's really going to be meaningful.
So you're in a really interesting position because not only are you making these investments, but you also have a media platform from which to talk about the investments you're making, to highlight other technologies out there. And I'm curious how you think about the interplay between those two, like the broader ecosystem. You mentioned you send things along to other investors.
Mm-hmm.
Like, where do you wish there were more innovation, I guess, is my question. What is the company that you wish you could interview or fund?
Such a great question. I really want to find, there are a couple of these companies that exist right now, but again, we all showed off our cute animals at the beginning.
This is a dog interlude, yeah.
Chasing the delivery guy. I have been looking for the kind of company that is perfectly connecting renewable finance projects with financing. So there are a couple of companies who are doing a version of this. Just one second.
In this interlude, we invite all of our members to show off their dogs. Any background dogs? Oh, Sally's showing off. Oh, Sally also wants me to remind everyone that it is perfectly acceptable to drink on camera if you so desire, because this is a happy hour. Please do not feel like you need to have your camera turned off. This is a member happy hour and we encourage libations.
Thank goodness, because dogs are a journey. Before I became a VC, I was thinking to myself, I kind of want to start a company that could connect people who want to, because everybody wants to do something about climate change. Not everybody, but a lot of people, but they're not sure what to do, right? It feels like this really uphill climb. And I thought, I wish I could create a platform that would connect people who want to invest for returns with climate companies or renewable energy projects. And one of my friends was like, why don't you just raise a fund? And I was like, well, I don't know, I guess. But what I have discovered since then is that there are iterations of this that people are trying to build. And I'm just waiting for the one that has figured out the pricing and figured out the model to connect everyday investors and institutionals with these renewable energy or other green projects that need financing. There are versions of this that exist, but this is like the marketplace dork in me that's like, there's a lot of money and there are a lot of projects that need finance that have some version of risk attached to them. And that there's a way to bring these two things together that could be really impactful and also give people, just everyday people, returns.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I'm
that
surprised that it doesn't, I feel like those kinds of like marketplaces are tough because there's so much about implementation, right? It has to be perfect implementation, and there are a lot of legal especially with investing, a lot of legal considerations.
Yep. I talked to, I can tell you, I talked to one, they didn't have their FINRA certification. And I was like, yeah, that's fine. You can't do that. Yeah. So it's going to exist, but I'm interested. I like the idea of connecting people with action in some way. But honestly, what I love about being both a journalist and an investor is I don't have to come up with any ideas. People just bring them to me and they're amazing.
It is a very inspiring space to be in. I think that's one of the things that I love about the work that we do as well. Like I get to go out and find companies that are doing amazing work and try to help them succeed. So I'm curious. So you mentioned so if you're focused on seed funding for consumer companies, what other firms out there do you recommend for different stages in the process? Like if I'm a climate investor, or if I'm a climate entrepreneur at a different stage, like who else do you think would be a good, what other firms would be good to approach?
For seed or for later or all of those?
The things that fall through your cracks.
Right.
Like what are you passing on?
There are, I really like if you're too late for me, I really like this firm Obvious Ventures, which was founded, I think, by one of the co-founder by Eb Williams, the co-founder of Twitter. They're just doing super interesting, like they're taking the risk with synthetic bio, and they were really early in Proterra, the electric bus company. They're just fascinating. Lower Carbon Capital is Chris Sacca's operation, and they're doing just sort of all kinds of all stages, I think, of climate investing. I really like this firm called Amasia, AMASIA, for two reasons. One, their thesis is really around driving impactful behavior change, which I sort of like. It feeds into a little bit of my consumer idea, but they're not only consumer. And they also, and this is like a year 2 goal for me at Launch, it's America and Asia. So they invest internationally because so many cool climate innovations are springing up all around the world, especially in countries that are being hit now. So like Indonesia is a hotbed of innovation out of some real necessity. So I like the fact that they're like bopping over to Singapore and Indonesia and investing there. Yeah.
Are there technologies that you've seen emerge out of countries that are, I think the US is pretty directly experiencing the impacts of climate change at this point as well, but I'm curious if there are other, like, is there an innovation out of necessity that you are most interested in or excited about?
There's the whole, actually, that reminds me that another firm I'm a big fan of is Lightsmith Group, which does adaptation and resilience investing. And they're very heavy into right now, because there's this sort of, for a really long time, and actually the way I came to covering climate solutions was through adaptation and resilience, because again, I'm just really pragmatic. I was like, all right, look, it's here, that we're not going to be able to avoid some of the worst effects. How are we going to survive? That's what I called my coverage series, How We Survive. And so Lightsmith does adaptation and resilience specifically. For a long time. That was the, like, I don't know, do we still redheaded stepchild? Like, it was the unloved portion of the climate conversation, because people were like, if we invest in adaptation, we might take money away from mitigation. We've given up. Exactly. So there are, I think, adaptations happening, like vertical farming, and, in Indonesia, for example, there's a big push to figure out really simple stuff like hot swappable scooter batteries for micromobility, because you just can't have every car on the road be gas or diesel. And there's also, I know an investor who's, they're more like a incubator, global incubator, and his obsession is boat engines. He's like, we just have to have electric boat engines because there's so much coastal boat travel.
And it's unregulated. That's the other
And
thing.
it's unregulated.
Right? Because it's in, if you're traveling in international waters.
Yeah. You just are like, you can do whatever. Well, yeah, that, and also just the little like ferries that go around coastal areas, or even just tugboats, like even just fishing boats. It doesn't even have to be like big international sailing vessels. It's just like all the little boat travel that happens between islands in the South Pacific.
So I'm going to open it up to audience questions in just a few minutes. So if you have a question for Molly, raise your hand and I'll call on you. But before we do that, I want to say two things. One is that the Fire for the last year has been working on an action tank initiative, which is focused on renewable energy. And we are also, Evan Anderson, who is here, is now starting to do the preliminary footwork to build out another similar initiative focused on ocean health. So I'm just saying that, Molly, because I feel like you probably have some good ideas of companies that might be interested in partnering on that, and you two should connect. But the last question I have for you is much more menial, or what's the word? Yeah, I guess menial is an all right question, or not all right word, which is, you work with someone who is, one of the biggest personalities in investing, certainly has a reputation for being outspoken. What is it like to work with Jason Calacanis on a daily basis?
I mean, it's not a reputation. He is definitely all outspoken. I feel really lucky because, and listen, all of my friends, all my girlfriends were like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, I'm not sure how I feel about you going to work with Jason. And some guy friends too. It's not specifically a girlfriend thing, because he does have this big reputation and he is very outspoken and he's very brash and he's at times controversial. I feel lucky that I have known him for almost 17 years. And so I have had enough time to know that he is all of those things, and also a really good human who has done really kind things for me when nobody was watching. And when I see the way that he interacts with our team and the rigor that he puts behind the investments that we make, and the amount of kind of like teaching and mentoring that he's offered to me and also the people in our company, and also just the really like honest kindness that he uses on our founders, like he's not BSing them. Right. He's obviously not a BS guy. And sometimes it's bad news and sometimes it's harsh, and it's always honest, and it's always with really a lot of compassion. And I'm always like, yeah, like
fair.
He's a wild man, and I generally trust him to be a decent person. I don't love all his friends.
That's a good one-liner.